Banker laughs at black veteran's loan application. You people don't belong here. But what the banker doesn't know is that Marcus has a secret weapon, and he's about to unleash it. Marcus Johnson clutched the business plan in his sweaty hands, his heart pounding as he stepped into the imposing bank building. The cool air inside did little to soothe his nerves as he scanned the bustling lobby. Men and women in crisp suits moved with purpose, their shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. Marcus adjusted his tie, acutely aware of how his second-hand suit hung loosely on his frame. As he approached the loan officer's desk, memories of another high-stakes moment flashed through his mind. The scorching Afghan sun beating down on his patrol, the eerie silence before chaos erupted. Marcus blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes felt just as high. "Mr. Caldwell?" Marcus asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The loan officer looked up, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Yes, that's me. And you are?" "Marcus Johnson. I have an appointment to discuss a business loan." Caldwell's gaze flicked over Marcus, lingering on his dark skin before settling on the folder in his hands. "Ah, yes. The auto repair shop, was it? Have a seat." Marcus sat, straightening his posture as he handed over the meticulously crafted business plan. "Yes, sir. Johnson's Veteran Auto Service. I've put together a comprehensive—" "I'm sure you have," Caldwell interrupted, barely glancing at the document before setting it aside. "Now, Mr. Johnson, let's discuss your financial history. Any outstanding debts? Bankruptcies?" Marcus frowned. "No, sir. As I mentioned in my application, I've maintained an excellent credit score despite some challenges after my military service. If you look at page 3 of the business plan, you'll see it detailed." Caldwell held up a hand. "I'm more interested in your current employment and income. Are you working now?" "I'm between jobs at the moment, focusing on getting this business off the ground. But I have savings and my wife works full-time as a teacher." A smirk played at the corners of Caldwell's mouth. "I see. And how do you plan to manage a business with no experience? Auto repair isn't exactly a typical career path for someone like yourself." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Someone like myself, sir?" "You know, someone without a business background," Caldwell said smoothly, though his eyes told a different story. Outside the bank, Denise Johnson paced the sidewalk, checking her watch every few seconds. She muttered a quiet prayer, hoping for good news. The couple had poured their hearts and savings into this dream, seeing it as a way for Marcus to use his skills while helping fellow veterans. Inside, Caldwell's attention was drawn to a well-dressed white man approaching his desk. Mr. Thompson, just a moment, please." He turned back to Marcus. "I'll need to review this further. Why don't you come back next week?" Marcus watched in disbelief as Caldwell greeted Thompson warmly, laughing at his jokes and poring over his documents with genuine interest. Within minutes, handshakes were exchanged, and Thompson walked away with a broad smile. "Mr. Caldwell," Marcus said, his voice tight, "I couldn't help but notice how quickly you approved Mr. Thompson's loan. I provided all the necessary documentation, and my credit score—" "Mr. Johnson," Caldwell cut in, his tone sharp. "Every application is different. Mr. Thompson has a proven track record in business. You, on the other hand, have no experience and no current income. The bank has to consider these factors." Marcus leaned forward, his frustration mounting. "With all due respect, sir, my military service provided me with leadership skills, discipline, and technical expertise. I've outlined how those translate to running a successful business. If you just take the time to review—" "I've seen enough," Caldwell snapped. "Your application is high risk, and I don't believe you have the necessary qualifications or cultural fit for this type of venture." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Cultural fit? What exactly do you mean by that?" Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "I think we're done here, Mr. Johnson. I'll be in touch with our decision." Marcus stood, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "No, we're not done. I demand to speak to your manager. This is blatant discrimination." "Discrimination?" Caldwell scoffed. "I'm simply doing my job, assessing risk. Now, if you can't control yourself, I'll have to call security." "Call them," Marcus challenged, his voice rising. "Let them hear how you're treating a decorated veteran who's trying to build a life after serving his country." The commotion drew the attention of nearby customers and employees. Caldwell's face reddened as he reached for his phone. "That's it. I'm calling security. You're causing a disturbance." Marcus held his ground, even as two security guards approached. "I have every right to be here and to receive fair consideration for my loan application." As the guards escorted Marcus out, he caught snippets of whispered conversations and curious stares. Humiliation burned in his chest, mixing with the righteous anger that propelled him forward. Outside, Denise rushed to his side, her face etched with concern. "Marcus, what happened? Are you okay?" He shook his head, unable to find the words to explain the injustice he'd just experienced. Denise wrapped her arms around him, offering silent support as they walked away from the bank. Later that evening, Marcus sat in their small apartment, staring at the business plan that now seemed like a cruel joke. Denise brought him a cup of coffee, sitting beside him on the worn couch. "Maybe we should try another bank," she suggested gently, "or look into small business grants for veterans." Marcus nodded absently, his mind replaying the day's events. He couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how qualified he was, doors would always be closed to him because of the color of his skin. As Denise channel surfed, trying to distract them both, a news report caught Marcus's attention. "Local bank under investigation for discriminatory lending practices," the headline read. He leaned forward, listening intently as the reporter detailed allegations of systemic racism in loan approvals. "That's it," Marcus said, standing up suddenly. "I'm not going to let them get away with this. There has to be someone who will listen, someone who can help us fight back." Denise looked at him with a mix of pride and concern. "I'm with you, baby, but we have to be smart about this. We can't afford to lose everything." Marcus nodded, determination replacing the despair in his eyes. "I'll go to the VA office tomorrow, see if they have any resources or advice. And I'll reach out to some of my old military buddies. Maybe they've dealt with something like this before." As they prepared for bed, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his friend Mike, another veteran he'd served with. "Hey brother, heard you had a rough day. Meet me at O'Malley's tomorrow night? First round's on me." Marcus smiled, grateful for the support. He replied with a quick affirmative before turning to Denise. "I'm not giving up on this dream, babe. We've been through worse, and we'll get through this too." Denise kissed him softly. "I know you will. You're the strongest man I know, Marcus Johnson. And I'll be right here beside you, every step of the way." As they lay in bed, Marcus's mind raced with plans and possibilities. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he'd faced impossible odds before and come out on top. This was just another battle, and he was determined to win not just for himself, but for every person who'd ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. The next morning, Marcus woke early, his military habits kicking in despite the restless night. He donned his best suit, the one he'd worn to military functions, and headed to the VA office. The waiting room was crowded, filled with veterans of all ages and backgrounds, each bearing visible and invisible scars of their service. As he waited for his turn, Marcus struck up a conversation with an older veteran beside him. The man, introducing himself as Frank, listened intently as Marcus shared his experience at the bank. "Ain't much changed since I came back from Nam," Frank said, shaking his head. "But don't you give up, son. Your service means something, no matter what those suits say." Marcus nodded, grateful for the encouragement. When his name was called, he squared his shoulders and walked into the counselor's office, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did he know, the woman behind the desk, Sarah Miller, would become a crucial ally in his fight for justice and the realization of his dreams. As he began to share his story, Sarah's eyes lit up with a mix of compassion and determination, signaling the beginning of an unexpected partnership that would change not just Marcus's life, but the lives of countless veterans facing similar battles. Marcus trudged up the stairs to his apartment, his shoulders heavy with defeat. The memory of Caldwell's sneering face haunted him, a stark reminder of the prejudice he'd faced. As he reached for his keys, a flash of yellow caught his eye. His heart sank as he peeled the eviction notice from the door. "No, no, no," he muttered, scanning the document. The words blurred together, but the message was clear. Pay up or get out. In 30 days. He stumbled inside, collapsing onto the worn sofa. The apartment, once a symbol of their fresh start, now felt like a prison closing in around him. Marcus buried his face in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Denise found him like that an hour later, still clutching the crumpled notice. Her face fell as she read it over his shoulder. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. "We'll figure this out. We always do." But her words, usually a balm to his troubled soul, rang hollow. Marcus pulled away, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "How, Denise? How are we going to figure this out?" His voice cracked. "I can't even get a loan to start a business. Who's going to hire me now?" Denise reached for him, but he flinched away. The hurt in her eyes was like a knife to his gut, but he couldn't bear her touch. Not now. Not when he felt like such a failure. "I'm going for a walk," he mumbled, grabbing his jacket. The cool night air did little to calm his racing thoughts. Marcus wandered aimlessly, his feet carrying him to a familiar haunt, O'Malley's bar. The neon sign flickered, a beacon for lost souls like himself. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the bitter scent of spilled beer. Marcus nodded to a few familiar faces, fellow vets who understood the weight he carried. He slid onto a bar stool, ordering a whiskey neat. As the liquor burned its way down his throat, the TV above the bar caught his attention. A news anchor's voice cut through the din. Allegations of discriminatory lending practices at First National Bank. Sources claim the bank has systematically denied loans to minority applicants. Marcus snorted, turning away. What good was an investigation now? It wouldn't put a roof over their heads or food on the table. A hand clapped him on the shoulder, startling him. Mike, his old army buddy, grinned down at him. "Hey, brother, didn't expect to see you here tonight." Marcus managed a weak smile. "Yeah, well, rough day." Mike's expression softened. "Want to talk about it?" Before Marcus could respond, a voice from down the bar cut in. "Oh, boo-hoo." Another vet crying about how tough civilian life is. Marcus tensed, his fists clenching. Mike put a warning hand on his arm, but the stranger wasn't done. "You guys come back expecting handouts and special treatment. Maybe if you'd learn some real skills instead of playing soldier." Marcus was on his feet before he realized it, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. "What did you say?" The man, red-faced and swaying, sneered up at him. "You heard me. You're not special just 'cause you wore a uniform." Something snapped inside Marcus. All the frustration, the humiliation, the fear, it all came pouring out in a rush of violence. His fist connected with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. Chaos erupted. Bodies pressed in, trying to separate them. Marcus fought like a man possessed, blind to everything but the need to hurt someone, anyone. It took Mike and 2 other vets to drag him off. As the adrenaline faded, shame washed over him. He stumbled out of the bar, ignoring Mike's calls. The next morning, Marcus woke to a pounding headache and a sense of dread. Denise was already gone, a note on the fridge saying she'd taken an extra shift at the school. He couldn't meet her eyes last night, couldn't bear to see the disappointment there. With nowhere else to turn, Marcus found himself at the VA office. The waiting room was a sea of familiar faces, men and women bearing visible and invisible scars of war. He felt a kinship with them, a shared understanding of the battles they still fought long after leaving the battlefield. Marcus Johnson? He looked up to see a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "I'm Sarah Miller. Why don't you come on back?" In her office, Marcus found himself pouring out the whole story. The loan denial, the eviction notice, the bar fight. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowing as he spoke. "Marcus, I'm so sorry you're going through this," she said when he finished. "But I think there might be more to your story than you realize. Do you mind if I take a look at your file?" He shrugged, beyond caring at this point. Sarah turned to her computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard. As she scrolled through his records, her eyes widened. "This can't be right," she muttered. "Marcus, according to this, you received a general discharge. But that doesn't line up with your service record or the commendations mentioned here." Marcus leaned forward, confusion etched on his face. "What are you talking about?" "I received an honorable discharge. I have the papers at home." Sarah's expression turned serious. I believe you, but something's not adding up here. There are inconsistencies in your file, redacted sections, missing documents. It's almost as if she trailed off, lost in thought. Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but persistent. What does this mean? He asked. Sarah met his gaze, determination blazing in her eyes. It means we've got some digging to do. I can't promise anything, Marcus, but I think there's more to your story than meets the eye. Will you trust me to look into this? For the first time in days, Marcus felt a spark of something other than despair. He nodded, a tentative smile tugging at his lips. As he left the VA office, his phone buzzed. A text from Denise. I love you. We're in this together. Always. Marcus took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he wasn't walking it alone. With Denise by his side and Sarah in his corner, maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, the events of the past few days played on a loop in his mind. The sneering face of Caldwell, the crumpled eviction notice, the satisfying crunch of his fist connecting with the drunk's jaw. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the images, but they persisted. Beside him, Denise stirred. Another nightmare? She murmured, her hand finding his in the darkness. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. It wasn't just the memories of war that haunted him now. It was the feeling of helplessness, of being trapped in a system designed to keep him down. Talk to me, Denise urged, propping herself up on one elbow. He turned to face her, drinking in the concern in her eyes. I'm scared, Dee, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. What if this is it? What if this is as good as it gets for us? Denise was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his arm. Do you remember what you told me when you proposed? She asked finally. Marcus frowned, caught off guard by the change in subject. I said a lot of things that day. She smiled, the moonlight catching the tears in her eyes. You said, I can't promise you an easy life, but I can promise you won't face the hard times alone. That goes both ways, Marcus. Whatever comes next, we face it together. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. The scent of her shampoo, familiar and comforting, grounded him. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Denise pulled back, fixing him with a stern look. None of that. You're a good man, Marcus Johnson. A hero. And heroes don't give up, even when the odds are stacked against them. As sleep finally claimed him, Marcus's dreams were a jumble of images. Caldwell's sneering face morphing into the features of enemy combatants, the bank's imposing facade becoming a war-torn building in Kandahar. But through it all, Denise's words echoed, heroes don't give up. The next morning, Marcus woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't control how others saw him or treated him, but he could control his response. He wouldn't let Caldwell or anyone else define his worth. As he sipped his coffee, a news report caught his attention. The anchor's voice filled the small kitchen. In local news, First National Bank is facing increased scrutiny over allegations of discriminatory lending practices. A whistleblower has come forward with evidence suggesting a pattern of denying loans to minority applicants, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. Marcus leaned closer to the screen, his heart racing. This was the same bank that had rejected his loan application. Could there be a connection? Before he could pursue that thought further, his phone rang. It was Sarah from the VA office. Marcus, I need you to come in as soon as possible, she said, her voice tight with excitement. I found something in your records, something big. As he hurried to get dressed, Marcus felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was about to turn. Marcus stared at the letter in his hands, the bank's logo mocking him from the top of the page. His eyes skimmed over the formal language, catching phrases like regret to inform you and unable to approve your application at this time. The rejection felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. He crumpled the letter, tossing it across the room. It bounced off the wall, landing next to the eviction notice that had arrived days earlier. The walls of their small apartment seemed to close in around him, a visual reminder of how quickly their world was shrinking. Denise found him like that, sitting in the dark, surrounded by the debris of their crumbling dreams. She didn't say a word, just sat beside him, and took his hand. Her touch, usually a comfort, now felt like an anchor dragging him down. How could he face her, knowing he'd failed to provide for their future? "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Denise squeezed his hand. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Marcus. This isn't your fault." But her words, meant to reassure, only twisted the knife deeper. Because it was his fault. He was the one who couldn't secure a loan, who couldn't find steady work, who was dragging them both down with his nightmares and his anger and his inability to fit into this civilian world that seemed determined to reject him at every turn. The shrill ring of his phone cut through the heavy silence. Marcus fumbled for it, recognizing Sarah's number from the VA office. "Marcus? It's Sarah. I need you to come in right away. I found something big." Her excitement was palpable, even through the phone. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, quickly doused by the weight of recent disappointments. "What is it?" he asked, not daring to let himself believe it could be good news. "Not over the phone," Sarah insisted. "Just get here as soon as you can. Trust me, you'll want to see this in person." As he hung up, Denise looked at him questioningly. "What was that about?" Marcus shrugged, already reaching for his jacket. "Sarah says she found something in my file." "Probably nothing, but—" Denise stood, determination etched on her face. "I'm coming with you." The drive to the VA office was tense, neither of them daring to voice their hopes or fears. As they walked through the doors, Marcus felt the familiar weight of memories pressing down on him. How many times had he come here, seeking help, only to leave feeling more lost than ever? Sarah was waiting for them, practically vibrating with excitement. She ushered them into her office, closing the door behind them. "I'm so glad you're both here," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "Marcus, do you remember when I mentioned those inconsistencies in your file?" He nodded, thinking back to their last conversation. "You said something about redacted sections, missing documents." Sarah's eyes gleamed. "Well, I did some digging, called in a few favors. And what I found—" She paused, building the suspense. "Marcus, your military records were classified. Heavily classified." Marcus frowned, confusion replacing his earlier trepidation. "That doesn't make sense. I was just a mechanic, nothing special." Sarah shook her head, sliding a folder across the desk. "According to these documents, you were much more than that. There's mention of a covert operation, something that went sideways. And this." She pulled out a document, its header bearing the seal of the President of the United States. Marcus's eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "A presidential commendation?" he whispered, disbelief coloring his voice. "This can't be right. I never—" "It's all here, Marcus," Sarah said gently. "The mission details are still classified, but the commendation is clear. You're a hero, Marcus. A decorated war hero." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Denise gripped Marcus's hand, tears shining in her eyes. "I always knew you were a hero," she said softly. "But this, why didn't you tell me?" Marcus shook his head, still struggling to process the information. "I didn't know. I swear, Dee, I had no idea." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "That's not uncommon in cases like this. Sometimes the trauma of the event can cause memory suppression. Or, in some cases, soldiers are deliberately kept in the dark about the full scope of their actions for security reasons." Marcus's mind raced, fragments of memories flashing before his eyes. The sound of gunfire, the acrid smell of smoke, a voice shouting orders in the darkness. He'd always attributed these flashes to his PTSD, to the general chaos of war. But now, what does this mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's smile was triumphant. "It means, Marcus, that you have options. This commendation, combined with your service record, opens doors. There are programs, grants, opportunities specifically for decorated veterans. And more importantly," she paused, making sure she had their full attention, "it means that bank had no grounds to deny your loan application. None." The implications hit Marcus like a tidal wave. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go back there," he said, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "I need to talk to Caldwell, make him see." Denise stood with him, concern etched on her face. Marcus, wait. Maybe we should think this through, come up with a plan. But Marcus was already moving towards the door, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. No more waiting. No more being pushed around. It's time they saw me for who I really am. The drive to the bank was a blur. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. Denise's voice faded in a background noise as he rehearsed what he would say to Caldwell, how he would make the man understand the gravity of his mistake. As they pulled into the parking lot, Denise made one last attempt to slow him down. Marcus, please. Let's think this through. We can make an appointment. Come back when you're calmer. But Marcus was beyond reason. The weight of years of discrimination, of being overlooked and underestimated, propelled him forward. He strode into the bank, ignoring the curious glances from other customers. Caldwell was at his desk, his smug expression faltering as he recognized Marcus. Mr. Johnson, I believe we've already discussed your application. There's nothing more to. Marcus slammed the folder down on the desk, cutting him off mid-sentence. You made a mistake, Caldwell. A big one. He opened the folder, spreading out the documents for Caldwell to see. The loan officer's eyes widened as he scanned the contents, his face paling. This changes things, Caldwell stammered, reaching for the phone. Let me just call my supervisor. We can discuss. No more discussions, Marcus growled, his voice rising. You judge me based on the color of my skin, not the content of my character. You didn't even bother to look at my full record. Caldwell's expression hardened, a flicker of his earlier arrogance returning. Now see here, Mr. Johnson. I made a decision based on the information available to me at the time. You can't just come in here making accusations. Accusations? Marcus laughed bitterly. I heard you, Caldwell. On the phone that day, I heard what you really think of people like me. The color drained from Caldwell's face. He reached for the security button under his desk, but Marcus was faster. He grabbed Caldwell's wrist, leaning in close. You're going to listen to me for once, he hissed. I am a decorated war hero. I bled for this country while you sat in your cushy office judging people you don't even know, and I'm not leaving until you make this right. The commotion had drawn the attention of other employees and customers. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they caught snippets of the confrontation. Caldwell, realizing he was cornered, tried a different tactic. Mr. Johnson, please. Let's discuss this calmly. I'm sure we can come to some sort of arrangement. But Marcus was beyond negotiation. Years of pent-up frustration and anger poured out of him in a torrent of words. He laid bare every slight, every microaggression, every door that had been slammed in his face because of the color of his skin. As his tirade reached its crescendo, Caldwell's face twisted with rage. That's enough, he shouted, standing abruptly. Security, remove this man immediately. He's threatening me. Marcus felt strong hands gripping his arms, pulling him away from the desk. No, he shouted, struggling against the security guards. You can't do this. I have rights. But his protests fell on deaf ears. As he was dragged towards the exit, Marcus caught sight of Denise's horrified face in the crowd. The shame of his outburst hit him like a physical blow, draining the fight from his body. Outside, the guards released him with a warning. Marcus stumbled, the adrenaline leaving his system as quickly as it had come. He sank to the curb, his head in his hands. Denise knelt beside him, her voice gentle but firm. Marcus, look at me. He raised his head, expecting to see disappointment or anger in her eyes. Instead, he found only love and determination. This isn't over, she said, helping him to his feet. We're not giving up, but we're going to do this the right way. As they walked to the car, Marcus felt the weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. He'd let his anger get the best of him, potentially ruining any chance they had of setting things right. But as Denise squeezed his hand, a small spark of hope flickered in his chest. They'd faced impossible odds before and come out on top. This was just another battle in a long war. And with Denise by his side, he knew he still had fight left in him. Little did Marcus know, his impassioned speech in the bank had not fallen on entirely deaf ears. As they drove away, a figure watched from the shadows of the parking lot, a cell phone pressed to their ear. Mr. Davis, you're going to want to hear about this. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, the weight of defeat crushing his spirit. The eviction notice glared at him from the nightstand, a stark reminder of how quickly their world was crumbling. Denise's gentle touch on his shoulder felt like an anchor, but even her unwavering support couldn't lift the fog of despair that enveloped him. "Maybe it's time to give up," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We've fought so hard, Dee. And for what? Every door slams in our face." Denise knelt before him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Marcus Johnson, don't you dare talk like that. You've faced worse odds and come out on top. This is just another battle." But her words, usually a balm to his troubled soul, rang hollow. Marcus stood, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "A battle? This is a war, Denise. A war against a system that's rigged from the start. And I'm tired of fighting." The shrill ring of his phone cut through the tension. Marcus ignored it, but Denise snatched it up, her eyes widening as she saw the caller ID. "It's Sarah," she said, holding out the phone. "You should answer it." Marcus hesitated, then took the device. Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker, urgent and excited. "Marcus, you need to come to the bank right away. Mr. Davis, the regional manager, he wants to meet with you. He saw the security footage from yesterday." His heart sank. "Great. So now I'm going to be arrested for causing a scene?" "No, Marcus, you don't understand. He's furious with Caldwell. This could be the break we've been waiting for." Hope, that dangerous emotion he'd tried so hard to squash, fluttered in his chest. He looked at Denise, saw the determination in her eyes, and made a decision. "We'll be there in 20 minutes." The drive to the bank felt surreal. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as Denise reviewed the documents Sarah had uncovered. His mind raced with possibilities. Would this be the moment everything changed, or just another crushing disappointment? As they pulled into the parking lot, Marcus spotted Sarah waiting for them, her face a mix of excitement and nervousness. Beside her stood a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, Mr. Davis, the regional manager. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Davis greeted them, his handshake firm. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, let's step into my office." The walk through the bank felt like a march to the gallows. Marcus could feel the eyes of employees and customers on him, whispers following in their wake. Caldwell was nowhere to be seen. In Davis's plush office, the tension was palpable. Marcus sat rigidly, Denise's hand clasped tightly in his own, as Davis settled behind his imposing desk. "Mr. Johnson," Davis began, his voice grave, "I want to start by offering my sincerest apologies for the treatment you received at this institution. I've reviewed the security footage from yesterday, as well as your loan application and the additional information Ms. Miller provided." He paused, his gaze intense. "What happened to you was unacceptable. Mr. Caldwell's actions were not only unprofessional, but blatantly discriminatory. He has been terminated, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, almost too good to be true. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but caution kept him silent. Davis continued, "Furthermore, I've taken the liberty of reviewing your loan application personally. Mr. Johnson, your business plan is solid, your financials are in order, and your service record." He shook his head in disbelief. "It's nothing short of extraordinary." He slid a folder across the desk. "I'm prepared to offer you the loan you requested, with a reduced interest rate and extended repayment terms. It's the least we can do to begin making amends." Marcus stared at the folder, unable to process what was happening. Denise squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. "Mr. Davis," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." Davis held up a hand. "There's more, Mr. Johnson. Your story, it's powerful. It highlights a systemic issue that goes far beyond this bank. With your permission, I'd like to bring this to the media's attention, not just as an isolated incident, but as a catalyst for change in our lending practices across the board." Marcus's mind reeled. Everything he'd fought for, everything he'd dreamed of, was suddenly within reach. But with it came a new responsibility, a chance to make a difference not just for himself, but for countless others facing similar battles. He looked at Denise, saw the pride and love shining in her eyes, and knew what he had to do. "Mr. Davis, he said, straightening in his chair. "I accept your offer, but on one condition. I want to be involved in reshaping your diversity and inclusion policies. My story is just one of many, and it's time they all were heard." Davis's face broke into a genuine smile. "Mr. Johnson, I was hoping you'd say that. Consider it done." As they left the bank, loan documents in hand and a media statement being prepared, Marcus felt a surge of emotions he couldn't quite name. Relief, certainly. Pride, absolutely. But there was something else, something that had been missing for so long. Hope. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. The media picked up Marcus's story, and suddenly he found himself thrust into the spotlight. Interviews, panel discussions, community meetings, his calendar was full, his voice finally being heard. But the real work was happening behind the scenes. Marcus threw himself into working with the bank's diversity team, sharing his experiences and helping craft policies that would ensure no one else faced the discrimination he had endured. As word spread, something unexpected happened. The community rallied around Marcus in ways he never could have imagined. Veterans groups offered support and resources. Local businesses pledged to work with his new auto repair shop, and donations began pouring in, far exceeding the amount of his original loan request. The day of the grand opening dawned bright and clear. Marcus stood before the gleaming storefront of Johnson's Veteran Auto Service, surrounded by a sea of familiar and new faces. Denise beamed at his side. Sarah and Mr. Davis stood proudly nearby, and even some of his old military buddies had flown in for the occasion. As he cut the ribbon, cheers erupted from the crowd. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his heart full to bursting. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice strong and clear. "A few months ago, I stood in this very spot, feeling like the world was against me. I was ready to give up, to accept that some dreams just weren't meant for people like me." He paused, looking out at the sea of supportive faces. "But I was wrong. What I've learned through this journey is that our greatest strength lies not in fighting alone, but in standing together. In recognizing that my story is just one thread in a much larger tapestry." Marcus's gaze found Denise, drawing strength from her unwavering support. "They tried to bury me," he said, his voice rising with emotion. "But they didn't know I was a seed. And with the support of this incredible community, that seed has grown into something beautiful, not just a business, but a movement for change." As applause washed over him, Marcus felt a profound sense of transformation. He was no longer just a veteran struggling to find his place in the world. He was a voice for change, a beacon of hope for others facing similar battles. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still systemic injustices to fight, minds to change, and a business to run. But as Marcus looked out at the faces of those who had rallied around him, Denise, Sarah, Mr. Davis, his fellow veterans, and countless community members, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer fighting alone, and together, they would create the change they wished to see in the world, one small victory at a time. As the celebration continued around him, Marcus caught Denise's eye and smiled. They had weathered the storm together, emerging stronger and more determined than ever. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities and hope. Marcus Johnson, once buried by prejudice and systemic injustice, had blossomed into something extraordinary, a seed of change, ready to take root and grow in the hearts and minds of all those he touched.